It is certainly my pleasure to be with you in this, the second in a series of lectures that the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, in collaboration with the University of West Indies, has been putting on in this season of lectures. As you know, Professor Sir Henry Fraser delivered the first lecture, and I am privileged, not as in the West Indies team, to follow the first batsman in. I mean, what has happened to the West Indies team in the last few months says to me that there's no privilege in following the opening batsman anymore. The topic that we are dealing with tonight is a topic that has engaged my attention now for the last 7 or 8 years. It really began when I visited the Public Records Office, the National Archives in Britain, and came across 1,000 pages of reports written by various British military doctors who had served in the Caribbean theatre during the period from the 18th right down into the, rather from the 17th, late 17th into the early 19th century. When I came across these documents, one of the first things I did was to look to see whether they had been cited or quoted anywhere else, and when I discovered that they had not been, I claimed some ownership of them and began to transcribe the entire set and to do some research preparatory to preparing an edited version of these reports. And that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. So that some of the research that is going to be presented here tonight involves what I've been doing with that set of documents. The other thing, of course, that has occupied my attention, again related to the question of documents, has to do with what has been happening to us in this region over the past few years. And as you know, over the past few years, we've been suffering from a number of hemorrhagic distempers, which go by various names, dengue being one of them, of course. And of course, in the most recent is that one with a very appropriate name, chikungunya. I say very appropriate because within the Barbadian context, most people don't understand it's a Tanzanian construction. And when they hear chikungunya, they immediately think of chicken, and they assume that the chicken has got you or something has happened. But that is what has been recent. And I thought in that context that I could not begin the lecture, even though the lecture is going to be a little more technical than looking at the mosquito itself, without having a few pictures, a few nice pictures of the mosquito that is a culprit in these various ailments. Presented before you, there are a couple of pictures, a couple of prints that I've got on the internet, and it's a rather beautiful creature. Excellent. I mean, it is well constructed for the purpose. It's fit for purpose. Small, very pretty, very adaptable. The mosquito. If you can go right down again, just a little further down, yes. Let's just run through them very quickly. When I discovered these on the internet, I said to myself they were a treasure. And but what you see now on the screen is the one of particular interest. It is really an examination of the presence of the Aedes aegypti mosquito, that mosquito in the Western world. West Hemisphere. And if you look on the left of your screen, the map of the Americas, you see the areas dotted in red, or rather shaded in red. And that area that you see shaded in red over to your left represents where in around 1920, when after they discovered that the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, was the vector for yellow fever. By that time, after they'd used the relevant chemical agents and they'd done some cleaning of the environment, the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito, was largely confined to the areas that you see on the left in red. Well, that's 1920. By 2002, which is what is represented in the next map, the map on the right, that is the picture of the spread of the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And in that context, we can begin to understand why it is that in the last year or two, in the Americas, in this part of the world, we've been afflicted by the chikungunya virus because of that massive spread since, as I said, since 1920. 1920, not too many years after the discovery that the Aedes aegypti mosquito was the vector for yellow fever, you had almost eradicated across the world. And let me hasten to make the point that the eradication of the Aedes aegypti mosquito was largely took place in the habitable regions, and this relates more to the eradication of what is known as urban yellow fever. I have to make that distinction because there is a variety of yellow fever known as jungle yellow fever, and another version known by some people as sylvatic yellow fever. But the urban yellow fever, that's the one that we're dealing with primarily. And that was largely controlled. Now we have other ailments. It's not only chikungunya, it's not only occasional yellow fever outbreak, but also I understand the West Nile virus is also associated with the mosquito. So a very small creature, but very ubiquitous, very pretty, but dangerous and deadly. So that against that background of the contemporary period, what's been happening in the contemporary period, I now turn my attention then to the subject matter as detailed in my lecture for tonight. The study of healthcare in colonial Barbados represents one portal, one gate through which the researcher might obtain insights into the social milieu in which healthcare professionals operated. Additionally, since the 18th and 19th century social order differs in specific ways from our modern social environment, it is important to carry out a minute inspection of the thoughts that predominated in that earlier social environment. And of course, I'm referring to the environment of the 18th and 19th centuries. And the thoughts of that early environment predominated in the area of healthcare provision. And these inform us of the nature of medical knowledge at that time. In this context, our view focuses on the medical practice that surrounds the treatment of yellow fever, and in particular, the identification of the cause of this scourge. From a modern, contemporary perspective, we might be surprised at the failure to identify the mosquito as the immediate cause, or certainly as the vector. But that would be to employ the benefit of hindsight. However, we intend to identify the prevailing medical theories that govern the treatment of fevers and to show that these theories precluded the association of yellow fever, or for that matter, other scourges such as malaria, with the mosquito. We shall be facilitated in our investigation by engaging with reports of selected doctors who served in the Caribbean sphere, with special reference where the data permit to the Barbados experience. I have had a discussion on this next section of the lecture before, and it has to do with the arrival of yellow fever in Barbados and New World. But since my last foray into discussion on this, there are other facts which have surfaced. At the arrival of Europeans in Barbados and in New World, and more specifically in Barbados, it is clear that they had never before encountered the tropical scourges that they were shortly to experience. There's a book I seem to recall the title is The Columbian Exchange, and it has to do with what happened once Europeans came into this portion of the world. They moved from a temperate climate, and they came into a tropical environment, and there were things that were waiting in the dark and in the light, the likes of which the doctors had never encountered. There was the threat of malaria, there was the threat of dengue, and of course, as it turned out, the worst threat of all, the greatest threat to the safety of the troops and the safety of the settlers was yellow fever. In the case of yellow fever, it was not until the 1640s that the first reports of a new perilous distemper, as some will put it, began to enter the record books. And I focus on the 1640s here because you recognize that this is a significant number of years after the first arrival of Europeans. But in the 1640s is when you get the first mention of this new disease. In 1648, as far as the actual records go, the first direct mention of a new illness called vomito prieto, or black vomit, was recorded by the Spanish in the Yucatan Peninsula. However, it seems likely that the source of that outbreak was Barbados. Indeed, in that same year, 1648, as noted by a 1941 article by a medical practitioner, or rather medical researcher, Professor G.M. Finley, in that year, in 1648, the Massachusetts authorities issued an ordinance banning ships from Barbados and other Caribbean territories from landing at Boston. The basis for this ban was that the plague, and it's on the screen, or the infectious disease, have exceedingly raised in ye Barbados, St. Christopher's, and other islands of the West Indies, to ye great depopulation of those. So this is where we're getting, as with respect to the British Caribbean, some of the first recorded references to the appearance of yellow fever. The Yucatan outbreak also coincided with an outbreak in Guadeloupe. This latter epidemic, that is in Guadeloupe, was reported by Dutetre, a Catholic priest, as having originated first in St. Christopher, that is St. Kitts, and it had spread to Guadeloupe by way of a ship called the Boeuf, which had sailed from France to St. Kitts and had brought some of the sick and dying from St. Kitts to Guadeloupe. It appears that the beginning of the epidemic in St. Kitts, Guadeloupe, and the Yucatan was really predated by an outbreak in Barbados in 1647. Indeed, Finley's research posits that the epidemic has started in Barbados in September of 1647, and it was still present in that island in 1648. Richard Ligon, who was resident in Barbados from the late 1640s, noted that the disease he encountered in the island, and which other later researchers refer to as yellow fever, was then called the Barbados distemper. It's a bit unfortunate that such a beautiful island, tropical paradise, could be associated with something with such a sinister name as a distemper. But that is the reality. Several commentaries on the situation in Barbados at this time assert that the disease that Ligon encountered with yellow fever. We do, in that context, bear in mind the contrary view held by Henry Rose Carter, a researcher of the 1930s, whose 1931 survey of the historical literature posits the possibility that the description of a disease sweeping Barbados at that time was malaria, represented an outbreak of malaria, rather than yellow fever. However, we might come to that observation fairly easily by noting that malaria was never endemic in Barbados. And further, malaria was and is never associated with the level of mass mortality that was associated with yellow fever. So as far as I'm concerned, Henry Rose Carter has missed the boat on this issue. In the case of Barbados, one estimate is that the epidemic might have killed as many as 6,000 persons in the period between 1647 and 1649. And that's a large mortality. And I know of no place where malaria does that. Not in those numbers. Yes, there's some mortality attached to malaria, but not in such a small place, such a small population. Certainly, McFarlane Burnett and David White, in their 1972 study entitled The Natural History of Infectious Diseases, had no doubt that the first appearance of yellow fever in the New World can be traced back to a period when, quote, it seemed to rise like a miasma from the overcrowded stinking holes of slave ships in Barbados in 1647. So certainly there's one researcher who shares my view that yes, the thing began in Barbados. Given the persistence then of the view that the Barbados yellow fever experience in 1647 marked the first entry of the scores into the New World, and the further consideration that it coincides with the beginning of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, we might note other considerations that suggest the accuracy of the historical narrative. We refer here to the fact that there appeared to be a general immunity on the part of the enslaved African community. That is, while some blacks did succumb to the disease, the mortality rates were significantly lower than those of the European population. Certainly, David Clyde's 1980 study of healthcare in the British military forces in Dominica shows that in one severe period, and that's for 1 year, 1804, 1 of every 2 whites suffering from yellow fever died, while the comparative figures for black soldiers of the time was 1 in 43. The implication here is that blacks had had a previous contact with yellow fever and thus had acquired some limited immunity, while whites had not had that same exposure. It is reasonable then to assume that the arrival of enslaved Africans, some already carrying the yellow fever virus, along with the importation of the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti mosquito in the ships that brought the enslaved Africans, provided what we call the environment in which the disease could be incubated and which it could spread. We do, however, need at this point in our historical narrative to acknowledge at least one historical survey that takes an opposite view to that just posited on the question of racial immunity to yellow fever. And I refer here to the work of Mariola Espinosa of the University of Iowa, and her paper was published around 2003, and she's presented some arguments which she posits provides enough reason for historians to discard any belief in black immunity to yellow fever. In one section of a paper entitled provocatively, "The Question of Racial Immunity to Yellow Fever in History and Historiography," she cites the observations of an 18th century physician, who we'll hear about again, Robert Jackson, who wrote a treatise on fevers and their treatment in the Caribbean in the 1790s. According to Jackson, black people who arrived in the Caribbean from Europe or the higher latitudes of America were not exempt from being infected by the yellow fever virus. Espinosa also makes the point, in citing the chief doctor of the French Navy in the 1790s again, that when a yellow fever epidemic hit Cayenne in the French Guianas, all of the population, whites, blacks, and mulattoes, suffered alike. And she quotes this doctor saying, "Neither race nor native residents mattered when they were exposed to the disease." So that's a view that seems to challenge the notion of some racial immunity, a certain immunity for blacks. Credit must be given to Espinosa for unearthing the evidence for black mortality in yellow fever. However, the point he made is that in general, especially in the Caribbean sphere and certainly in Barbados, as several surveys by British military and naval doctors of the 18th and 19th centuries were sure, black mortality was always significantly lower than white mortality. You must also note that the conditions under which blacks lived were more likely than not to lend themselves to serious health problems, and therefore to increase the likelihood of succumbing to yellow fever. Blacks lived very often in huts. They often were bereft of clothing. They lived in conditions, and the nutrition was certainly not of the quality that the white population had. In that context, we must not ignore then the evidence that points to conclusions other than those reached by Espinosa. Indeed, she makes the telling statement that, quote, "as yellow fever," I'm not sure if that is in our slides, "as yellow fever is endemic to the forests of West Africa, and the region was the origin of more slaves imported into the New World, these epidemics provide valuable evidence on the possibility of black immunity to the disease in the Caribbean and the surrounding areas." So I don't know why she made all the fuss I don't know if she argued for us to discard the view of relative black immunity, and then still tells us that because it was endemic in the forests of West Africa, and it was the origin and West Africa was the origin for most of the enslaved people coming across the Caribbean, and said it provides for the possibility. I say we thank her nevertheless for raising the point, but we leave it there as far as she's concerned. Another consideration in my presentation tonight has to do with the possibility for a source for the yellow fever other than that of Africa. So we have to come to that as well. We acknowledge that there are two main variants of yellow fever. I referred to them already. One known as jungle yellow fever and the other as urban yellow fever. There is some evidence that jungle yellow fever is found in some South American locations where it can be transmitted to humans from primates. Additionally, as Pedro Nogueira's historiographical survey shows, there are references to epidemics in Yucatan in the Mayan codices. That is, before Europeans arrived, he argues that there are references to epidemics in some of the Mayan writings. And there's reference also in some historical records to epidemics in Hispaniola and Santo Domingo. But these latter two, that is the epidemics in Hispaniola and Santo Domingo, coincided with the arrival of Europeans and Africans into the New World. Certainly, it's well known that among Columbus's first ships, when he arrived in the Caribbean, there were at least 2 Africans. And then later, voyages to the Caribbean also brought Africans, even before the slave trade began and expanded. The point to be made is that most of the epidemics that took place in the Caribbean were of the urban yellow fever variety. And this is unmistakably more associated with an African origin than the other jungle fever that we associate with some locales in South America. With these considerations, these preliminary considerations in mind then, our attention now turns to the question of medical views on the treatment of fevers among other illnesses as a precursor to unraveling the state of medical reaction to this new scourge. For the Europeans who migrated to the New World in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries, it would be expected that they would have resorted to familiar therapies that could be utilized in dealing with the new diseases that they had encountered. The various therapies that would be employed were themselves based on long-held philosophies that could be traced back to ancient times. One of the best-known medical historians of modern times, Professor Roy Porter, observes that the ancients had identified, quote, 4 crucial vitality-sustaining juices, namely blood, choler, or yellow bile, phlegm, and black bile. These the ancients considered accounted for such physical aspects of existence as temperature, color, and skin texture. As Porter observes, in examining these ancient beliefs, blood made the body hot and dry, choler made the body damp and warm at the same time. Contrariwise, phlegm made the body cold and wet, and black bile produced cold and dry sensations. Connections were drawn between these fluids and their associated effects, and the 4 elements posited by Greek philosophers as being essential to existence. That is, being hot and agitated, blood was like the air, choler was like fire, hot and dry. On the other hand, phlegm suggested a parallel with water, while black bile was parallel with the earth, cold and dry. Any imbalance in these fluids led to disease. That is the view of the ancients. And the therapeutic approach attempted to restore the balance by expelling the toxic elements from the body through purging, sweating, copious urinating, and vomited, not to omit bloodletting. I know about the purging because that has persisted to our time. I remember as a young boy, before we went to school, after the holidays, our grandparents resorted to a regime of purging. There was a time when I could not drink any orange drink without tasting castor oil. Because what would happen is that you get the castor oil, And then immediately following get that dose of castor oil, she gave me a quarter, not a half, a quarter of an orange to help to mask the taste of the castor oil. So for years, so even when juices came on stream in Barbados and had orange juices, when I drank orange juices, I had a problem. My mind told me that I could also taste castor oil. In addition to these notions, from the Middle Ages right up to the late 19th century, another view held sway. That is that many infectious diseases were due to what was called miasma. The term, as you would have heard in any previous lectures, refers to a widely held view that there were poisonous vapors that filled the air. These vapors were held in suspended particles of decaying matter that was often associated with foul smells. Indeed, the term malaria itself is reflective of this view. The term malaria is composed of two words of Latin origin, mala for bad and aria for air, bad air. That's what malaria was said to be, where it resulted from miasma. Thus, long before contagion and later germ theory would come to compete with miasmatic theory, European visitors to the New World were already so wedded to long-held theories on the causation of disease that any consideration of the tiny mosquito as a cause of yellow fever was, to put it mildly, impossible. You could not, because from your perspective, disease was caused by miasma, by this thing, this invisible thing in the air. Incidentally, I have a theory. I think most of you have heard in Barbados what we call the lightning coal. I think you've heard of lightning coal. If you haven't heard of the lightning coal, I'll tell you, particularly for those who might be visiting with us and might not be familiar with what it is. It has to do with the view that when women had given birth, you had to protect them from the air. And you had to ensure that these women that every crevice in the house was stopped. And they had to remain there, I can't remember if it was 40 days, but they put pieces of newspaper, pieces of paper in every crack and crevice to stop the air from getting in. And I have a theory that the reason for that is that those people who held up to that view, that the air could cause these problems, were really subscribers to a miasmatic viewpoint. So although we're talking about a viewpoint that dates back centuries, it appeared in Barbados, and I dare say that it still exists in some places. Because a young lady who has a baby and is so insensitive to the older people as to walk about that baby in the open, just a few days after birth, and especially at night, we'll hear the old people reprimand that young person and say, "You're frightening, you get lightning coal." And the lightning coal really is a corruption of the lying in coal. You got a coal that's related to the lying in period when the woman, just after the woman had given birth. So we continue. In addition to the philosophical underpinnings that inform medical practice in Britain and the colonies, the medical practitioners of the period were wedded to the medical writings of a few authorities. Until enough experience had been gleaned by practice in the tropical environment of the New World, and writings that detail that experience were published, practitioners of the 18th and 19th centuries were heavily dependent on a few medical authorities, the most prominent of whom might be a doctor called William Cullen, C-U-L-L-E-N. Cullen was a medical practitioner and intellectual who rose to become professor of what is called physics. Physics was an old way of speaking about medicine. Became professor of physics at the University of Glasgow between 1744 and 1755. And he later obtained the prestigious chair of professor of physics at Edinburgh between 1755 and 1789. In particular, he was a prolific publisher of several treatises on medicine, the most influential of this work being perhaps his research on fevers. And his research on fevers had the impressive title, there was a research on what he called nosology. But nosology was really his way of talking about classification of diseases. Cullen. Fevers, in Cullen's view, could be caused by a variety of factors: miasmata, contagion, heat, cold, venery, fear, dirt, putrefaction, or bad air. So the miasmata is there all along. Again, we might note that this attribution could not lend itself easy to any consideration of an insect cause. How can a minuscule insect be considered when everybody knew that the real cause was something else? Once practitioners were bound by Cullen's formulation, it was unlikely that they would have paid any attention to any other cause of yellow fever other than that which they considered to be the truth. When it came to the question of treatment too, we find that Cullen's treatment regime, consistent with the prevailing therapeutic philosophies, would almost be transferred lock, stock, and barrel to the colonies. Perhaps we might permit William Bynum, physician and medical historian of the Wellcome Institute, to summarize the main elements of Cullen's approach to fever therapy, and I have that on the board. The treatment of, notice I said board. You got that? I said it's on the board. Now, that dates me. Because, as you know, of course, I came long before it had any these modern technology. So I was accustomed to board, so that is still my language. The younger people, I suppose, will have another language. But he says, this is Bynum talking about Cullen's work, the treatment of fever was complicated and must be related not only to the different stages of the fever paroxysm, but to the identified causes of the complaint and to the peculiarities of the patient's constitution, temperament, and mode of life. Notice that temperament and mode of life, because we'll come back to that sometime later. Although stimulant therapy, wine, opium, tonics, cinchona bark occupied a central position, many other therapeutic procedures had their place in Cullen's fever armamentum. He cautioned against excessive and indiscriminate bloodletting in fevers, but this and what was referred to as other antiphlogistic remedies had he felt this circumscribed use. In short, he was not averse to taking a little blood from time to time, in addition to all the other things that he would do. Moreover, in congruence with the prevailing views of other medical contemporaries, sweating, vomiting, and diarrhea could be viewed as the body's attempt to solve the problem of disease and to restore equilibrium. And in that case, these reactions could be involved to effect a cure. However, Cullen felt that in some instances, these expulsions had to be countered, since they could lead also, quote, to a depletion of nervous energy, causing debility. Thus, again, as Hynum summarizes, despite the contingencies of the clinical course of the disease, debility dominated an attack of fever, and therefore therapy in general must be supportive and stimulant rather than antiphlogistic and depletive. In short, we have a man, Cullen, whose work is ancient in terms of its impact, but who has a variety of approaches to the problem that he faces. Apart from Cullen's work, which you see more than an occasional reference in the chronicles of European doctors serving in the Caribbean, we mention the work of Robert Jackson, Edward Bancroft, and James Lind. Jackson was the author of some 23 books and pamphlets. The works relevant to our survey are his work, A Treatise on the Fevers of Jamaica, published in 1791, an outline of the history and cure of fever, epidemic and contagious in 1798, and a sketch on the history and care of febrile diseases, published in 1817 and again in 1820. Jackson was a scholar who was fluent in several languages. Apart from serving in the army, which began with a commission as surgeon to the 3rd Regiment of Foot in 1793, he also spent some time in civil practice as a physician in Jamaica. He was commissioned as physician to the forces in 1795 by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. His works, especially on fever, were often cited by doctors treating yellow fever in the Caribbean. In the 1,000 pages of reports I've had the pleasure of reading through and going through, there are frequent references to these authorities. So if you want to know what doctors are doing and what they're reading, these reports give you a very minute look. They offer a panoramic view of the status of medicine and medical thought at the time. Edward Bancroft was the author of a work, essay on the disease called yellow fever, with observations concerning febrile contagion. It's published in 1806. And this work was often also cited by doctors treating yellow fever in the Caribbean. In addition to long service in Jamaica, he has served in the military medical service in the Caribbean theater. Bancroft earned his Bachelor of Medicine degree from Canterbury in 1794 and subsequently qualified with the MD in 1804. He was appointed as physician in 1795, as physician to the forces. He ended his career in the military service as Deputy Inspector General of Hospitals in 1840 and died in Jamaica after a stay of some 31 years at the age of 71. Like Jackson, he had acquired considerable experience in the Caribbean and was also vetted, also connected in his mind, thinking to the prevailing miasmatic theories. The third doctor in my list, James Lynn, did have some Caribbean experience as well, but not apparently as extensive as that of his other contemporaries already mentioned. He is best known for his clinical approach to the problem of scurvy. And if you're doing any survey at all on the treatment of scurvy and you want to look at its history, James Lynn is one of the persons who looms large. He was largely responsible for the adoption eventually by the Royal Navy of anti-scurvy modalities of treatment. He was best, he wrote an essay entitled an essay on the most effectual means of preserving the health of seamen. That's 1762. An essay on the diseases incident to Europeans in hot climate, 1771, and 2 papers on fever, 1773. There are other doctors who wrote after considerable experience in the Caribbean area, but the ones I have listed have been selected because they appear so often in the writings that I have been looking at over the past 7 years. In all of these cases, and in the case of their readers, these doctors, and in the case of their readers, there might be some variation in the assessment and treatment of fever cases, but the adherence to miasmatic theory, even if that was moderated somewhat in the early 19th century by a discussion on contagion, precluded any radical departure from the theoretical position of the ancients. So by the time you get to the early 19th century, around 1803, 1804, we can well say that there's a commonality in terms of the way how doctors view the world. So now, having looked at that what we call that background, that lesson in medical history, we now look at the specific response of British military doctors, other than the ones we just mentioned, because apart from Cullen, Jackson and Bancroft and Lynn were doctors in the military services. But the ones we're looking at are some of the doctors that I have discovered in my looking at these reports, and I share some of that with you. We may note, in looking at these doctors, almost as a recurring decimal, that a consistency in our discussion is the assertion that medical practice in the Caribbean sphere pointed such practitioners away from the mosquito as a vector. All their medical practice pointed them away. None of their medical practice allowed them to identify mosquito. But I ask myself the question, because when you read these things, you can't always read them with an academic mind. So you have to read them with what they call a consensical mind. Commonsensical mind. You live in Barbados, or you're staying in Barbados. One of the most ubiquitous of pests at night is the mosquito. You're going to sleep, and somewhere in the middle of what we, as Bajans say, in the middle of the night, you wake suddenly to hear this sudden whir, this whine in your ear. And you very frantically, you try to get rid of this thing. I always wondered, how on earth, with the presence of so many mosquitoes, so much bush, how on earth the fellas simply missed it altogether? But the answer again comes because all of their training, all of what they were reading, all of their medical discussions were pointing them away from any such consideration. That is basically what it is. It is clear that in the expansion of the British Empire and the exposure of the British troops to tropical diseases, that the issue of yellow fever will soon become a major concern for the military authorities. Indeed, Dr. J.D. Alsop, in his well-researched paper, Warfare and the Creation of British Imperial Medicine 1600 to 1800, observes, and I quote, yes, in the well-regarded treatises of Dr. James Lind, naval surgeon during the War of Austrian Succession, and founding physician of the Royal Navy's Haslar Hospital, considerations of maritime health were dominated by the microclimate of the ports and shorelines of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Not surprisingly, therefore, naval writers became responsible for some of the more prominent analyses of the hot climate diseases encountered within the expanding British Empire. Simply to say, the doctors that we're looking at are in the business of investigating what becomes a threat to the very survival of the British Army. It is not surprising then that in exploring the journals of the various doctors who serve in the British Navy and in the British military, that we find detailed discussions on the various medical theories of the day, and that many of the doctors we encounter were highly motivated to discover the cause of the various ailments that afflicted the military and civilian patients. If we take, for example, the narrative of W.J. Warner, a surgeon who served in the Caribbean theater in the late 18th century, we get a glimpse into the concerns and approach of these doctors. On October the 1st, 1797, he writes in his journal while on board the vessel, the Alfred, and that quotation is now on the board. And this is how it begins. A narrative with remarks on the malignant fever, commonly though erroneously styled the yellow fever, which appeared on board His Majesty's ship Alfred at Port Royal. This happened in Jamaica, in this case, in July 1796, and continued until the end of October following. This disorder having occasioned such much fatality and produced a variety of opinions of the nature and treatment of it. So here is the doctor beginning to tell you in the beginning in his journal that there's what we call a very wide discussion on this issue. He said, I have endeavored with some pains to obtain an idea of both. Both what? The nature and the treatment of the thing. From my observations, aided by those of many practitioners with whom I have conferred on the subject, the following remarks are the best my judgment and ability enable me to offer. So here's Warner. He sits on a ship. He's not only Jamaica. The ship visits Barbados. It goes through the Caribbean. And he has a concern. He wants to know what is the cause and the effect and how do you treat this disease. The first thing we notice is that in his report is that yellow fever poses a challenge to those who have to deal with its effects. And there was no certainty as to how to handle this challenge. We also note that Warner is quite prepared to investigate the matter and to seek solutions. The key here, however, is that he's prepared not only to use his own observations, which might be safe enough, but also to rely on those practitioners who he believes had some knowledge. In this case, we can be almost certain that he will be relying on such authorities as Jackson, Lynn, Bancroft, and even Cullen, as were available to him. And incidentally, that's a word I don't have in the lecture, but I thought at this point, it just occurred to me that you need to be aware of how some of these fellows became doctors in the first place. To become a doctor in the Navy, and our research goes back to as early as the 15th century, you really went on board a ship and you served first as an apprentice. And as an apprentice on a ship, you might be known as what is called a loblolly boy. Now, I came across that word loblolly in another context. It's a term used apparently when the first enslaved people encountered cuckoo. They refer to it as loblolly. And having come across the term with reference to these fellows who were apprentices on board the boat as loblolly men, I came to the conclusion that the reason why the enslaved people might have referred to cuckoo as loblolly is that both of them were dealing with a mess. The fellows on board the ship had to clean up the blood, as I said, the blood and the guts, They had to deal with it, they had to assist with the sawing off of limbs. Well, they didn't saw off the limb, but they would hold on the patient, taking them. So they did a lot of gooey stuff. And I think that there's a congruence between the two terms, loblolly for cuckoo and loblolly for anything. Of course, cuckoo is a slightly different thing altogether, so we won't go there anymore, but just so you be aware. So you became a loblolly person, you're apprentice, and then somewhere along the line, after working for a number of years, you might become what we call an assistant surgeon. And you became an assistant surgeon when you acquired your own medical kit. That's basically what qualified you. And it often happened when the fellow who you worked as an apprentice for turned over the kit to you when he was about to retire. Or you bought the kit, because that's the way how you became a doctor and you served. And experience alone is the best teacher. Later on in the British Navy, when they began to insist on qualifications in the various universities, then some of these fellows later on they become qualified doctors. I was fortunate when I was doing my research to come across a publication, 2 volumes publications by British military historians they began to publish these publications from the 19th century, which recorded literally the names of every single doctor who served in the British military from about 1400s right up to the 20th century. So many doctors, I can tell you, when they became, because they recorded when they were assistant surgeons, when they were apprentice, when they actually became assistant surgeons, when they went to Edinburgh or Glasgow, when they got their medical training, and then finally when they were attached to hospitals and when they became known as physicians. Because you must be aware that they weren't called physicians until they had received the necessary training and qualifications. So, here you have Warner, who has all this, the relevant knowledge available to him. But we see that by this period, he has the symptoms of yellow fever well documented. They're well documented. There's no question as to the symptoms. In his case, the disease presents with frightening rapidity, and his summary of its progress could easily be recognized by any doctor in our modern period. And I've just chosen to put a couple of those extracts for you. I'm going to try to move on a little apace. But if you notice what he says about the symptoms, this is Warner, 1797. The symptoms as they appeared on board the Alfred at the worst period were prostration of strength, heavy, sometimes acute pain of the forehead, a severe pain of the loins, joints, and extremities, a glazy appearance with a bloody suffusion of the eye, nausea or vomiting of bilious, sometimes offensive black matter, not unlike coffee grounds, often attended with evacuations by stool of the same kind, the stomach rejecting everything offered. That clinical description is a description that almost any doctor today will recognize as an excellent rendering of the symptoms of yellow fever. Listen to the following quotation. It continues, the countenance flush, at other times pale and dejected with oppressive cold sweating, bleeding at the nostrils, the pulse sometimes for a short period full and quick, but more frequently languid, great thirst, the tongue white and brown at the edges, frequently covered by a white shiny matter, and as the fever advanced, became dry, brown, and crusted, a fatal appearance in general, and particularly so when attended with frequent flushing and loose stools, sometimes towards the close of a disease. A small red rash appears under the skin and soon disappeared, having livid spots where it has shown itself and was always a fatal sign. This is excellent clinical diagnosis. So you can't fault these doctors of the 18th century for their diagnosis. It's when it comes to a description of the treatments that were administered that we find ourselves torn between admiration for the good sense of his observations and frustration at his dependence on therapies that were clearly inimical to the survival of the patient. Thus, as Warner tells us, again, in the treatment of his disease, various modes were tried, all of which I am saying prove ineffectual in very many instances. You got that? proved ineffectual in very many instances. At this point, he speaks of the administration of calomel to his patients in order to induce salivation. And he states that, quote, with respect to its use, I was not bold enough to give it the trial recommended. Moreover, he declares that from the effect of the use of calomel, he was, quote, of the opinion it is an uncertain remedy, and in many instances is considered a hurtful one, as of more than 200 persons sent from the Alfred, not a third part survived the third day. If you read that, what would you assume? I assume that you'll be saying that here's a man who's well on the way to prescribing more beneficial therapies. But unfortunately, no. Indeed, let's go a little further. He's of the view that any recovery of patients who were subjected to calomel was due more to their, quote, being favored with a constitution capable of coping with disease as also to withstand the effect of so active a medicine. Warner asserted that he had come to this conclusion through observation and was convinced that this view was shared by other practitioners throughout the region. Indeed, he observed that death took place frequently after the mouth was severely affected by the medicine. In addition, he observed that many of those who were subjected to a regime of calomel, but who were said to be cured by it, quote, became exceedingly emaciated to the extent that they were unfit for duty for long periods. Warner even referred to some visitors to the West Indies who he was informed had been advised to take 10 or 12 grains of calomel weekly as a preventative therapy. In fact, one Captain Clark of the 5th West India Regiment, who had related this to him, informed him that he was himself one of 2 persons who were surviving out of 13. One of 2 who were surviving out of 13 who had followed this regime, and Captain Clark seemed happy with that result. Of course, he should be, because he was still alive. One cannot but feel that Warner related this encounter with Captain Clark tongue-in-cheek, as he ended his narrative by declaring that after his conversation with Clark, when Clark declared how happy he was with the treatment of calomel, but lo, as things are precarious in this life, he sickened the following day and fell a victim to the disease on the 3rd. That's Captain Clark. Calomel is a compound made with mercury, and that is what was considered to be the medicine of choice. And moving rapidly, he identifies other therapies. He refers to the use of strong spruce beer. That might have been a welcome addition to the medicine that the fellows received. But whatever the spruce beer could do, whatever benefits it had, and by the way, it was made from the spruce tree, and it was adulterated with some molasses and allowed to ferment. Whatever it was, he said, and I quote, it was a remedy who ought not to be solely depended on. In 13 cases when tried on board the Dictator, that's a ship, at one time 10 died. And after trial was made of its virtue at the hospital of Moll St. Nicholas, without affording a satisfactory effect. He also thought that the use of emetics, and especially of ipecacuanha, a member of the euphorbia family, he thought that the use of these things was beneficial. In other words, you had to get people vomiting, you had to get them sweating, you had to get them, quote-unquote, evacuating as far as possible. Moving on rapidly, at one point, he also refers to bleeding. And he said, a Navy surgeon, that's another quotation that you should get for you, of my acquaintance, bled in 3 cases, which he thought favorable to the purpose. Extreme debility followed, and death soon. And I have many reports similar from other gentlemen. And yet, although he knew all of this, he continued to bleed his patients. Now that's Warner. The next witness is Dr. John Arthur. He began his medical career in the 4th Royal Veterans Battalion in 1804. He served in Barbados for a long period. and had the opportunity to observe the course of several epidemics of yellow fever and chronicle the fate of scores of patients. From his stated observations, it is clear that he subscribed to a contagious viewpoint. That is, that the disease could be spread from subject to subject and could only be controlled by strict segregation of sufferers from the healthy. We might permit him to speak on the matter himself. As to the cause of the commencement of the late epidemic in this island, from all the foregoing facts as premises, that is his detail of several cases, I conceive but one conclusion can follow, showing it to have depended on the highly contagious nature of a disease and the total want and disregard of all health regulations in the island generally. Once Arthur had come to the view that contagion was the cause, he was subscribing to what some doctors now refer to as cautious postulates. That is, once there was a correlation between two things, and that correlation appeared to be fairly constant, then there can be no other explanation. So here you have it. You have somebody becoming sick with yellow fever in a house, and not too long after, somebody else got sick too, and somebody else in the same house got sick. And once you have that correlation, one person getting it, then another person getting it, then as far as he was concerned, contagion was proved. And how he solved the problem was to move, in the case of soldiers, he moved soldiers from one barracks outside. Took them outside, put them on the tents, and of course, moving them on the tents had the effect of moving them from the mosquito in some cases. But of course, he never understood that. His view was that he was moving them from the source of contagion to somewhere else. But he had missed the boat. In one case, when he had moved the men outside, this is how he renders his argument for contagion. That's the next quotation. They experienced some severe wet weather. He moved some soldiers from the barracks. They experienced some severe wet weather to secure them a bed from which the tents were generally made double by putting one inside the other and to raise them a little from the ground. A flooring was made in each tent by some rough, unplaned boards being laid loosely over 2 or 3 joists. The timber was obtained from the barracks department. There was no trouble in preparing it, nor any expense incurred, as it continued unaltered and fit for the original purpose of building. He had moved them out into the open. The rain had come. He hadn't associated anything of the disease to do with mosquitoes and rain, but he had moved them and he made sure they were secured against the rain. There was no yellow fever among that group that he moved, and ipso facto, he was saying, now we've proved the point. The feathers who were ill before, we have taken them out. We've taken these other feathers outside and put them on the tents. They're all right. But listen now to how he summarizes his understanding of all this issue. Next quotation. He says, if it depended on anything, talking about the disease in the atmosphere, breathed at the same time equally by all, would it be so tardy in its progress as it have been nearly 3 months in the bay and town before it made its appearance in a single case in the garrison? And on such a supposition, were not the very steps taken to retard and arrest it, and which proved so successful, and he's referring here to the fact that he moves the soldiers out into the open, have rather tended to promote and forward it in its operation, and have been the means of rendering it more general and destructive by removing the men from the shelter of the 5 large, comfortable barracks of mason work, and exposing them the more freely to all the influence of the weather. Let me just stop there a minute and get this out of the way. What he's really saying, I believe is contagion. I have put these men outside, I've taken them from the barracks, I have put them in tents, and he's putting his case for contagion, not mosquito. The issue is, I moved them. I put them out here. They were in a place where the air was allowed to circulate freely. If it were any other thing than contagion, and if the thing was miasmata, because he's also now arguing, it seems, against miasmata, if it's all these things, then we would expect them outside there, closer to the ground, being closer to the damp, to get yellow fever, but they don't get it. And so again, Arthur misses the point. Let's go a little further down He also, like all the others, did not reject bleeding as a therapy. So bleeding was common, standard. But then he gives an example of what happened when one of his colleagues was bled, a man called Dr. Caverhill. Caverhill, a doctor like himself, was affected by yellow fever, but opted to get bled. They bled him, they took 3 pints of blood from him. When Arthur came back into the room after he had been bled, he found him looking rather forlorn, and by that nightfall, Caverhill was a dead man. But even after that, we do not see Arthur saying that he's abandoning bleeding altogether. Bleeding is still resorted to. We move to the last lap. We come to another doctor called Tegart. And Tegart also observes what is happening in the disease. And he points to the fact that there's a big debate over whether it's contagion or otherwise. But even though he muses about the cause of yellow fever, we're going to miss that other quotation that he has, which begins but the name. We're going to pass that. But he looks at the whole question of the classification of yellow fever, but he comes to a view which is also important for our consideration. And his view is that the social habits of the soldiers led to yellow fever. There is a social origins argument that is also applied. And the quotation that I have there begins, "There were worse subjects for attacks of fever than any others in the garrison. The disease," read that with me, "disease commenced with them and was generated by them and proved fatal to several when no others in the garrison were affected by it." If a little further down the last few lines, he talks about when several severe and fatal cases occurred from the renewal of the existing cause, hard drinking. So these soldiers of the rank, the reason why they got yellow fever was because they were of the wrong class. And perhaps they didn't drink Madeira or some other more genteel spirits. They drank rum and moonshine whiskey. And for that reason, that is the problem. And finally, having seen these doctors for what they are, we come to the last doctor in our list, a man called Dr. George McDermott. He's a very systematic fellow in terms of how he goes about looking at the issue. If you just skip down, you've got to come to a table. I'm not going to detail it for you, but this is some of the evidence I've looked at in my lecture. The evidence is that of a man who is meticulous. He's recording deaths. This table you see here has the name of some persons who have arrived in Barbados, the age, their rank or their occupation, when they arrived, when they took ill, when they died, if they recovered, what the sickness was, and where they resided. Now that recording of where they resided is important. And if you look at some of the places where they resided, you see what they listed on the right side is the dockyard. Over the bay at St. Maurice. St. Maurice was a French baker. Over the bay and over by Colombo Rock. These are British troops stationed in the garrison. And the reason for detailing very closely where they were is because there was a notion that the disease was also caused by environmental factors. It's caused by men, by people, contagion, but it's also caused by environmental factors. The second table, we go through that and just pass it. Let's go through that table. But now we come to an important part of his report and the very last lap of this lecture. And this last piece I consider so important that I could not leave it out, even to get you out of here earlier. It begins with a statement from him, which details the kind of medicine he's using. And this is what he says: "I am not aware of any more effectual mode of practice than endeavoring to urge all the secretions by means of saline purgatives, diluents, and warm bathing. The saline medicines I chiefly use are Sadix powders. This is a name given to a medication composed of a number of mixtures, namely tartaric acid, sodium bicarbonate, and potassium sodium tartrate. Soda tartarisata, a similar thing, is a tartaric of soda. He also gives them something called Rochelle salts, and also something called Cheltenham salts. Cheltenham salts is what we call Glover salts. You've heard of Glover salts? All right. Cream of tartar, and I suppose the sweetest thing of all, the best thing of all he gave them was tamarind and cassia. That's the best thing that he has. It seems as though the tropical medicine is beginning to come into its own, so some of the tropical things that they've encountered are being used. Continuing, next slide in that series. When convalescence of a very severe compound gastric disease begins, grateful food and a small quantity of wine or porter with gentle alternative purging. See purging coming back up again? This is employed. Persons who cannot or will not swallow medicines or whose stomachs will not retain them may be treated by purging injections. And by the way, that injection is not what you think it is. There are no hypodermic needles as we know it then. Injection relates to an enema. You place the thing in the anus and you pump into the person something that will help to purge them. And he goes on to say, treated by purging injections, agreeable tisanes, and tisanes was a medicinal infusion of sweetened barley water. That's what tisanes were. And then he goes on to say, warm bathing, that perhaps was the nicest thing that he could give to them. And poultices to the epigastrium, that's the area around here. I think just around the solar plexus in that area around here, chest. He will rub some poultices. And by the way, one of the medical treatments was blistering. The idea was you had to restore balance. So in addition to purging, blistering was also a medicine of choice, medical therapy. Last piece there. When the vomiting is very harassing and when the stomach is very tender, the patient complaining that fluids passing down the esophagus are to the sensation like balls of fire, then I use drinks of the blander kind, tepid or cold water, tea, lemongrass tea, I like that, spruce beer, rice water, barley water, toast and water, cider and lemonade, and prescribe the hot feet and hands bath or the warm bath and purging injections again. But do not annoy the patient with purgative medicines except those of the mildest kind and that are pleasant to the taste and to the stomach. This detail from McDermott helps us in understanding where it was that after centuries of encountering yellow fever, our doctors could not associate the illness with the mosquito. Their various treatments were based on an ancient philosophy which focused more on restoring the balance to the body. The cause was an imbalance. The imbalance might be triggered by contagion, but certainly not by mosquitoes. So in closing, we return to our beginning. The simple fact is that 18th and 19th century doctors in the Caribbean were bewildered by the onslaught of yellow fever. They were wedded to theories and philosophies of an older age. And in that context, this led down a path that would lead them to overlook the mosquito as the vector that caused the spread of the disease. They were partially on the right track once a notion of contagion as a cause of the spread was entertained. In that case, those who argued for contagion were following a system of postulates which meant like this. There was a correlation between the outbreak of yellow fever in one person and it spread to others. However, once they had come to that position, they failed to answer the most important question satisfactorily. That is, how did the first occurrence take place, begin in the first place? You knew that And you might be right that there was something about contagion. Something spread from somebody to somebody else. But how did it begin in the first person? That was the question that they failed to answer. We know also that it was not until the later 19th century that germ theory would emerge and with it a greater understanding of the cause of diseases. This meant that 19th century doctors and 18th century doctors in the Caribbean sphere were largely adrift in a stormy sea without the required compass. In that case, this left the mosquito totally outside of the health telescope. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, thank you.